Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Antonio Nunez. Antonio is a brand strategist, corporate storyteller, and author of 8 books on storytelling. His clients include Novartis, BBVA Bank, HP, PwC, and the World Bank. His online course on storytelling is one of the top sellers on the Domestika platform, with over 25,000 students. I used to think storytelling was a skill completely grounded in reality, but Antonio's work has taught me I'm very wrong, because now I know that storytellers should use magical objects, that our religion is narcissism, and our spiritual animal is a donkey with very large ears. Ladies and gentlemen, Antonio Nunez. Antonio, welcome to the show.
Hi, Francisco. I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
So it's probably worth me explaining the donkey part and that I mentioned at the intro. So at the beginning of your Domestika course, you talk about Rocinante. I don't know what
Yeah,
the name of that donkey is in English, but that's the one. That's the donkey from Don Quixote, right?
that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And what is the story behind it? Why do you have a little Rocinante on your desk?
So it is something that I acquired. It's a craft that I acquired in Mexico during one of my travel trips there, and it's part of a traditional Mexican craft that I have on my desk all the time. And I also have 2 other crafts from Granada, Spain, that are precisely Don Quixote and Sancho. But that one is a donkey that it's an alebrije. And alebrije is that technique, that craft technique in Mexico. It's beautiful, it's colorful, and the whole idea, it has a story behind it. It's a myth uh, that basically it's animals with impossible shapes and combination of animals. So you can have a rabbit hybrid with a dog or a whale, and they paint that. And the story behind that was a craftsman that he lost his sight and became blind and started to imagine and craft and shape all those animals from his soul, and his soul started to produce those beautiful impossible creatures. Yeah.
Well, I have two very young daughters, and I think it's probably fair to say that most of the toys today could be called alebrijes, because at least the male toys, the shapes are not grounded in reality. Like
Yeah.
with women, it's slightly less bad than perhaps it used to be in my childhood. Although, to be fair, now I remember the He-Man and GI Joe toys, and those are not particularly grounded in reality. But anyway, the narcissism quote, I believe it's from Woody Allen, right? That he says when he grew up, he stopped believing in Judaism and started believing in narcissism, and it's something, I've talked about this plenty of times. But I think a line you used in your course is that the more personal it is, the more universal it is when it comes to stories.
Yeah. That is something that, most of my clients are corporate clients, and hence people that are educated and trained in the idea that being professional means to be extremely dry and aseptic and neutral when you are delivering your message. And also most of, I would say, the biggest fight that I have when I'm training or I'm working with projects like that is to convince people that they need to be more personal, and that the more personal they are, the more universal and the better they will reach to their audiences. Yeah.
Yeah, this is something that it seems counterintuitive to most people, which is that when you are talking about lots of people, particularly if it's hundreds of people or thousands of people, I think our brain just really struggles to find one person and care about that one person. Whereas if it's one person you're talking about that somehow represents everyone else, then it's easier. We can cope with that. So I've used before when I was giving a keynote, or putting videos on social media use the "Where's Wally" or "Where's Waldo" metaphor. Because that super crowded page is very difficult for our brain to latch onto. Like we don't, you just can't care about that. There's just too much noise. But identify one person, or in this case Wally, and then it becomes easy to say, oh, okay, so that person, I can be like that person, or maybe I'm not like that person. So yeah, I think that's a pretty important one, and strangely most people take a very long time to come to that conclusion.
Yeah. Well, we tend to think, especially executives, right, that it happens the same thing, a universal versus personal, with another one that is global versus local. And it happens the same. The more local your story is, the more universal it becomes. And this is really counterintuitive because you have the big filter of culture. And people say, oh, I don't know, telling a story about my little village in the south of Spain where we produce wine, etc., will not be universal. And the more specific and local you are, the more universal it becomes. Yeah.
I think that might be because of how difficult it is to add details when you're trying to be global, or when you're trying to zoom a little out of what actually happened. Because I think in your case, you're from Jerez, and you talk about how your family had a business and they worked with wine, and there's perhaps some expectation that you were going to follow into that business. Now, other places have families who have businesses, who have people that might be expected to follow into those businesses. And I think that's what people get confused. The part that is, Jerez and wine and whatever peculiarities of your region, those are just there to make it sound like a real place. Because if you say, in this village where there was a family, there's like, okay, fine, this sounds like a fairy tale. This is not real.
Mm.
So maybe I shouldn't think of it as real, and maybe respect whatever truth is coming out of that story as real, because it doesn't sound real. It sounds like a fairy tale.
Yeah, fully agree. That's why I always say is that there is a couple of details in your stories that are key to build credibility, and and some again, the part of a lot of corporate cultures is it's about remove all the details and go to the essence, and basically I always joke that is the risk is throwing the baby through the bathtub, right? Because you are trimming the key detail that will make your entire presentation or story or keynote or whatever credible to the people that are listening to you.
Yeah, no, I agree. And in your, oh, actually, before I start getting to some of the specific elements that you teach, I wanted to ask, because I'm not sure I understood this correctly, what exactly do you call projective attention?
Well, it's the one that is activated by storytelling and parts of our in our brain that creates an identification. Is the idea that when you are in that mode, that attention mode, what you're gonna do basically is to walk in the main character's shoes and think, what would I do if I was him or her? That's why when I'm again in corporate environments, I always says that any story should be understood as a case study, and our attention and our brain pays attention to that cultural case study. You pay attention to the story because you want to learn. Okay, if I am confronted to that same situation, the situation that this character is confronting, what would I do? What should I do? What is the cultural reward for that? Or the cultural punishment, right? So if I do this, I will be isolated. I will, have more taxes, or, I will be promoted, the opposite, or I will be. So you pay attention because of that, and you that projecting your individuality and your personality into the main character once.
Yeah, I believe that the Heath brothers from Made to Stick, they talked about how one of the most important things that stories do is, well, one of them is inspiration, and the other one is simulation. So it's this idea to put ourselves in the character's shoes. And I had another guest on the podcast a while back, Jason Reed, and he said, I think he called storytelling the original virtual reality tool.
Yeah, I like that.
Right. So one of the things that you talked about is, when you're talking about structure, is Actually, I think it's probably useful if I put down, if I say here what your definition of story is, at least the one I've come across in your course, and I believe it was that a story is a communication tool structured in a sequence of events that appeals to our senses and emotions, and when exposing conflict, it reveals a truth that brings meaning to our lives. I just want to pick some of these things apart as we go through, but I thought it was worth having it in there. So, one of the structures that you talked about that sounded very familiar to begin with, and then it didn't, was from Vladimir Prop. And if I remember it correctly, it was challenge, mentor, magical object, learning, battle, and reward. Have I got that right?
Yeah,
Well,
correct. Yeah.
okay, cool. So, um, so it sounds a bit like the hero's journey, but there's some parts of it that are not the hero's journey, and I think some of them are fairly clear. uh, Challenge, mentor, I think learning, battle, reward, they sort of they map out to other story structures that I've come across. The magical object was one that I don't think I had seen it that way. So I wanted to ask you about that. I've done some research now, and I've spoken to some other friends that they had some idea of something similar. But so, how do you define the magical object?
I would say that it's anything that helps the main character to confront his or her own fears and his lack of preparation or research or education when when they are confronting the conflict and they are confronting what they have to overcome, the challenge. And I think that it was designed by by stories in general to. And I say that it's magical because sometimes they are not real things. I mean, if you are given Excalibur spade, of course, sword. It will help you to fight, right? It's that is a very direct thing, but normally they are magical because they want to have a power or to transfer a power to the owner that it's not natural. It's something that it's amazingly powerful because you probably are amazingly scared of confronting your conflict. So I have a lot of examples of that, and that's why I do think that whenever stories are dealing with deep fears and that deep universal fears, there is that little help of that little object that can be an object or it can be a specific karate technique. Let's say Karate Kid, right? The movie, and that is one example where the kid learns that there is one specific way to basically beat any kind of enemy, no matter if it weighs 3 times more your weight. You will be able to do it if you use that. Or a more European example, Asterix and Obelix, where again they have that magical potion that they drink, and the minute that they drink it, they transform their bodies into amazing warrior bodies. No matter what if you're in shape or not, you will be able to beat the Romans. So yeah, I think that it's a very smart way to empower anyone that has fears and insecurities to confront any challenge.
I think it's fair to say that the crane technique from the Karate Kid would never work in real life and will get your ass kicked mightily if you try it. But no, what I think is really interesting about a magical object, because is that, as you said, there are ones that are very clearly a magical object, like a magical sword or something along those lines, or a magical ring, as in the case of the Lord of the Rings. But how they're when they're used as a representation, or even a plot device, but they don't have, the only meaning they have is metaphorical or is in the mind of the character. So the example that came to mind as you were describing it was the from Kung Fu Panda. There's that scroll that supposedly has magical powers, and the scroll actually is blank, there's nothing in the scroll, and the scroll is just there as a sort of a token of what the character needs to learn. And you had one example that I thought was incredible, and I would never have gone there necessarily, which was the wall that America was going to build, that Mexico was going to pay for. And that got me thinking. So when you talk to people in the corporate world about storytelling, and if you ever teach them that type of structure, would you recommend that they find some sort of object where there can be a representation of something that shows a turning point in the story?
Yeah, I always do that. That is part of, let's say, the recipe. If I can apply that recipe, and I've worked with many politicians and many political parties, and you have examples of people that are really by the book using that. I'm thinking, for example, Lula da Silva in Brazil, when he had that political program that was called Bolsa Familia, that basically it was. The aim was to remove people from poverty by giving a minimum amount of money to every single family. And for several years, it appeared to be working. And, international organisms and organizations were sanctioning the validity of that strategy. And it was said that there was a specific amount of millions of Brazilian people that were not in poverty anymore thanks to Bolsa Familia. And he spent his entire life in every single conversation going back to Bolsa Familia as his magical object. So I think that it's a very powerful way to make one story tangible, especially if you can see that magical object in reality. So it can be a car, or it can be a political idea or program. But if you have the opportunity of make something tangible, that is important. And we are seeing the same thing in advertising, right? And advertising campaigns, where sometimes they create something that was not tangible to represent an idea. I'm thinking, for example, one campaign that was targeting drivers, and the whole magical idea was to create a creature, that a human being with a shape that would avoid or would overcome any kind of car crash. And they recreated that with a computer, and obviously the shape of that human being is horrible, and they even showcase and replicate that and exhibit that human being, just to show us, hey, it's impossible that your body can overcome certain kind of car crash. Therefore, you need to drive more responsibly. So
Yeah.
yeah.
One example that came to mind was from Sarah Blakely, who is the founder of Spanx, and she uses her origin story on a regular basis, and she always talks about actually, you could argue she has two magical objects, because the whole origin story is about these white pants she bought, and she didn't have anything to wear underneath them because the underwear would show through. So then she decided to wear some leggings, and then she had to cut the leggings. It never worked, and then she eventually created the product that Spanx started selling in the beginning, which was this sort of legless leggings for women. Clearly, I don't know how these things are called, undergarments for women. But she also talked about how she used to go on sales calls, and she always had her lucky red backpack. And she talked about the red backpack over and over. I think in the original website there was a red backpack that appeared somewhere, and when she gave presentations, she used the images. She always talked about the red backpack, so it informed their visual branding. So I guess that would be an example of the magical object, not necessarily only in a story, but used beyond the story.
Yeah. There are plenty of them. I love to analyze how they work. Another one that is one of my favorites, it's pen that were used to sign very famous peace treaties, or again, political documents. And even there is a movie, O Contador de Historias, the storyteller, in a Brazilian movie, amazing movie. And there is an example where someone in the street is selling a very plain, normal sort of French big kind of pen, very affordable for everyone. And he's selling as if that was the pen used to sign a very famous political treaty in Brazil. So I think that interchanging, for example, the pens once you have signed by two political leaders is another ritual that is very popular. So we have plenty of examples in all kind of fields. Yeah.
I feel slightly embarrassed now because I am Brazilian and I don't think I've watched The Storyteller, which seems sort of unforgivable given what I spend most of my time doing. A couple of other things on the magical object, and then I'll move on. A friend of mine said that he started using that as an exercise to try and get stories out of people. So when he's doing a workshop, he's going to tell them, can you please bring an object that means something to you? I think we get it. The police is behind. It's outside your door. Hopefully they'll give us enough time to finish this. So he started asking people, bring an object that means something to you. And then people will bring whatever object it is and he'll say, okay, well, tell me the story behind that object. Or when did that start meaning something to you? And instead of just explaining why it means something, people go, oh yes, when I was 5, my grandfather, whatever. And then you get the story. And the other thing is to do with how people would use that, because I've seen a lot of storytellers, and this is an opinion I mostly share, being very much against props, for example, right? You're telling the story, it's an oral story, you're just telling it. They don't like the idea of a physical prop, because they say the moment the prop comes out, instead of you making a move inside my head, you're now a storyteller on a stage or whatever, performing a story, and that has sort of broken that magic. Do you tell people to, if they can use the magical object as a physical object, to use that, or not really?
I think that it depends on the personality and the kind of work. Sometimes my work goes beyond the idea of helping people to design the story, or helping corporation to design the stories, or helping the political candidate to I help them to tell them once they have created it, and everyone agrees in the organization. So in those times is where you need to have and understand what is that person's personality and individuality, and you need to sort of put into consideration if that person will feel better by having that object in his or her hands, or it will trigger a more authentic, let's say, story delivery. So I don't have like a rule for that. It is true, and I agree with you that sometimes whenever you imagine that we are projecting images in a PowerPoint or Keynote or whatever software, some people use them very smartly, and you pay attention to that image just for a second, and then you go back to the storyteller. And some others basically use them to be behind them, and to, a sort of shield, and not showing themselves. So I think that I first need to know a little bit more about the person and try to predict the way that they are going to use that object. Yeah.
The way I usually tell people what to do with images and slides and physical objects is, ideally use them for everything else, just not the story. So if the story is going to be 2 or 3 minutes in your presentation, or a few stories will be 2 or 3 minutes in your presentation, just tell the story. Don't have the slides showing what's happening in the story or anything like that, but then use images, not a whole bunch of text, for pretty much everything else that you can. Like, if you have a good image for whatever you're talking about, have the image by all means, but don't say, when I grew up in Jerez, my family grew wine. You don't need a picture of Jerez, a picture of wine, like, we know what wine is, we know what family is. We don't need okay.
I'm so sorry.
All right.
I'm living in New York, and New York is that constant noise in the street,
Yes.
no matter. Yeah.
Well, it happens. It happens. Right. So another thing you said, and again, I don't think I've come across this before. So I wanted to understand this a bit better. So you were talking about the meaning of stories, I mean, in Spanish was a sentido, but I think meaning would be the most proper meaning, or point would be the most appropriate translation. And then there was a line that said that the story is a tool of social cohesion or of social coercion. So can you just talk about that a bit?
Yeah, that's why I always says that any story, if it's a good story, will have a sort of a stick or a carrot, right? Which is it will teach you a cultural truth. Normally, the good ones and the ones that are, touching is because they are telling you a cultural truth that is not true anymore. So the entire group or country or whatever or ethnicity where that story is resonating, it it's shifting in the way that they understand a cultural truth. And let's say, put it as an example to be more concrete. Here in the U.S., we will never have a black man as a president of the United States. That is a cultural truth that was true till a certain moment. So any story that revolves about that cracking truth, that truth that maybe is starting not to be true in all kind of situations, that will have attached in the story a reward, meaning the main character confront that truth, and it's brave enough to challenge it, and then it will have the carrot, the benefit, maybe the social rewards of being an admired person for the rest of his or her life, right? Or the opposite, you have the stick, and is if you challenge that cultural truth, and if you dare to do that, then you will be punished, and maybe the punishment will be exactly the opposite. You will be ostracized. You will be a second-class citizen for the rest of your life. You will be removed of any kind of privilege or right, etc. Or you will live alone for the rest of your life. So that's why I say that the tool, the story, it's both a cohesion tool to create a common ground, a common culture, a common language, common values, and reinforce them all the time. Every time that we tell a story, we are reinforcing the validity of that cultural truth. Or the opposite is like, hey, by the way, don't you dare challenge that idea, because if you do, listen, that is what happens to this or that or that or that person that dare to do that. And then it's where you have the cohesion. You're part of the group, but you are obeying blindly the law. Yeah.
And something else that I don't believe this is you invented this, but you're definitely one of the first people that I've seen talk about this, is the very defined types of conflict. So I think you talked about three different types of conflict, and they are internal, external, and relational. Okay, so
Yeah.
internal is obviously, I mean, so that's an obvious enough conflict. External, I think it's essentially something that's happening in the world. It's not a feeling. It's not, it's an actual problem in the world. So, the Avengers is mostly about external conflicts, whereas
Yeah.
I know most Pixar movies are probably more about internal conflicts than external, at least. But the relationship type, can you just talk a bit about that one?
Yeah, that one is the kind of story and conflict that illustrates whenever you have to deal with someone else, and that someone else can be a peer, can be an enemy, can be it can be a different or an enemy army. So it doesn't, you don't need to. It is not individual to individual, but it has to do with how do you deal with your relationships, how do you deal with your father or with your mom once you are not a little kid anymore. You need to renegotiate the entire relationship, and you have a lot of challenges by when doing so. So that kind of conflict, it's extremely rich because it's very social, and sometimes it's impossible to illustrate them without also illustrating what is the character internal conflict or conflicts, because normally those relationship conflicts they have to do with internal wounds, of every single individual internal conflicts. Yeah.
So if the relationship conflict or the relational conflict has to do with, doesn't matter if it's one person or hundreds of thousands from a different army, as per your example, would the external one be, for example, you're trying to climb a mountain? That's an external conflict again. Okay, I would have seen this. I don't think it was you, but someone I know talking about how the external conflicts are the least interesting of the two, or at least powerful,
Well,
at least.
I don't agree with that. I think that they can be as important. For example, you have the environment and you have nature, and you have dealing with nature has been, a human battle since the beginning of time, and they can be extremely challenging and important because it's your life there in the line. Yeah, I think that they can be as important. Uh, when you moved into the movies realm, people say, okay, so basically you're talking about action movies, right? As you were saying, you have to climb a mountain, or you have to fly here or there. You have to, but those kind
Doesn't
of,
have to be action, right? I think Erin
yeah,
Erin
no,
Erin Brockovich arguably would be, I think, an external conflict, and it's not. It's a company,
yeah.
or it's it was kind of an environmental movie, but yeah, I would have thought that as an external conflict.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean they are equally important and equally powerful when you're creating your story. Yeah.
Yeah, so my feeling here, and feeling is a word that it just came out, I think, appropriately, because I think my instinct is that the internal conflicts or the relational conflicts are more likely to make a story relatable than the external one. Because if the external one doesn't also trigger a relational conflict or internal conflict, you're either relating to that specific thing, or you have to relate to something very similar to that. So maybe you have fought some, I don't know, bigger power, like she was fighting. I don't remember what company exactly she was fighting against, but and if you can do that, if you can find that connection in your life, the story might say less to you. Whereas if you have a problem with your family, I mean, that's one of the easiest things in the world to relate to. If it's you being afraid, you being disappointed, or whatever it might be, those are feelings we all have. Whereas the external circumstance of the story might be slightly less common. I think that would be my instinct.
Yeah. I agree, but then there is another factor that you have to take into consideration, which is sometimes entire societies project their emotions and conflicts into those external conflicts, or those. And I always use the very clear example of King Kong, the movie, and it happened in a cultural moment, and in an economic moment where everyone was extremely afraid of an economic crisis. And apparently the movie people tells you that every single time that you have uh, um, several months or years where the blockbusters are the main character, it's a big monster, they will tend to say that it is always related to a big fear that is going on in that society, and everyone is projecting the that fear or conflict into that monster. So, and King Kong is something that it's completely fictional and impossible, but it works because maybe people are putting there a meaning that is not so literal and it's more metaphorical. Yeah.
I wonder what it says about our society that King Kong versus Godzilla has come out this year. So I don't know if this is the pandemic or something else, but it seems like an appropriate movie for a time when everybody's concerned about something.
I thought in the same way, in the same fashion. I was thinking that it's amazing how Hollywood now is basically remaking and remaking and remaking the classic superheroes stories, and it's mostly mixing and matching very traditional characters, or maybe injecting a little external thing here or there, but it's surprising how literal and copycats those movies are, and it's also surprising how massively successful they are in this time.
It's interesting with the whole superhero genre because they finally, Marvel at least, seems to have finally cracked how to do it. And now they have no shortage of material, whereas DC has been giving us a Superman movie or a Batman movie every few years. Marvel has proven with like Black Panther that you can make a movie with a character that is not mainstream, that it wasn't necessarily a particularly good character, to be honest, on the comics, and they have 50 years of characters that have relations between them, that have a rich mythology, that are always very symbolic. So it will be interesting to see how long they can keep milking that very profitable type of movie, because it's been quite a while now since the first ones came out that were really successful, and they don't seem to be stopping anytime soon. So it'd be interesting to see when Marvel starts going back on doing a new Avengers movie, that rethinks the whole thing. That's when you figure out, okay, well, that I think it's about done now. But
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I think that what basically what they are doing is discovering that maybe those characters that were extremely, basic and very basic motivations, they are digging deeper into their internal conflicts, and then you have movies like Joker, right, where going deep into the characters' internal conflicts suddenly illuminates one side of that icon that was merely a facade, and suddenly it becomes humanized and even more interesting as a superhero. So it's the same thing with Cruella. That is the same. Well, let's dig into this horrible character and see why she was like she was, and it is very successful because that genre normally would touch that in a very superficial way instead of a deep dive into those internal conflicts. And I think that is what it's creating, the kind of remake that I am more interested in. Yeah.
Yeah, and something else that I so this is something that I don't know if you have a particularly strong opinion on, but it's something that I've seen a lot of people be very much against, and based on some of the stuff I've seen in your course, you don't seem to be, and it's the sort of debate about if to get the benefits of a story, you need to actually tell a story, a sequence of connected events. You have a character, you have a conflict, you have all those things that grounded in time and place, or if you can just use elements of a story. So if you pick those things out, but the way you're telling them are not actually a moment in time as a lot of stories are. And the reason I ask this is because you give a lot of examples of the types of common stories that most people need to tell. So you have the, who am I? Why am I here? The educational story, the visionary story, the values in action story, and the I know what you're thinking story. But a lot of your examples are designers and people that are not necessarily traditional storytellers. And what they're doing by a lot of people's conception of what a story is not an actual story. Philip Stark is one that most of the things he talks about the conflict in his life, but it's sort of floating in space. It's not grounded in compared to Alejandro Inarritu, that tells a very
Yeah.
specific story about he used to sell eggs, and then by 4 a.m. they were all sold, and that's how he paid for his film studies. So the question here is, do you think that to get the benefits of a story, it needs to actually be a story? Or as long as you're using enough of those elements, you get value out of communicating that way?
Yeah, well, in the Domestika course, it's targeting, and all those examples are from creative leaders. So it's very tough to find images of someone telling a full story. I mean, and I did a lot of hours of research for that.
So
I
you're
went
not
really.
obsessed by Philip Stark then?
No,
Okay.
no, not at all,
That
not at all.
right.
But basically, it came down to which interviews were free of rights, and I could use for the course, and that's why they are not. I agree with you. Some of them are not completely full stories, but I always say that if you don't tell the full, if your story doesn't have all the ingredients to be a true story, your message is it's for sure gonna be benefit by injecting a couple of ingredients or three ingredients or whatever. So if you pay attention and your message, your information has the right sequence of events, you're benefiting from that. Maybe you lack a conflict and then you don't have a story. But what it is for sure is that if you have paid attention to sequence of events or having a magical object or whatever, uh, yeah, it will be a better message. I agree with you that if you don't have all the ingredients, it's not truly a story. It can be an anecdote, it can be a joke, it can be a piece of message that it's resonating a bit more with that. That's one part, and then the other is that most of my clients are corporate clients, are companies, and they are a lot into sequential storytelling. So, you maybe you have to target your employees, and you have 5 4 7 emails to send about one single subject, and sometimes it's impossible to say, okay, you are gonna tell the full story here. And in movie terms, it's gonna be a movie, a full movie, or it's gonna be more a kind of TV show where you have different episodes, and every single episode maybe doesn't make sense by itself. It needs to be completed by the meaning and the story ingredients that you are exposed in every single episode. So that's why maybe for me, most of my work is about sequential storytelling, and then you need that kind of storytelling structure and ingredients.
Yeah, I think a couple of examples about the story elements versus stories. For example, Story Brand has made a name out of using story elements essentially to build websites. So you have very clearly a conflict at the tagline, and then there's a character, there's a guide, and all of those things. But actually, it's not a story; it's just a template for building a website that follows more or less the hero's journey. And the other one is Steve Jobs, because in his presentations, and I've used this as an example when I'm trying to explain to people what a strategy story would look like. And Steve Jobs always had heroes and villains, but he also had you know, in the beginning we only had one computer, so it was very easy to keep it updated. But then we had all the tablet and iPod and iPad and all these things, and the cables, and everything became a nightmare. We just never knew what was updated, what wasn't. So we started thinking of a new solution, and this was the iCloud, and now our life is a lot simpler. So it's not really a story, but it's using very clearly a story structure to get that message across. So yeah. But yeah, no, now understanding that the creative choices somewhat imposed on you by what they were targeting in that particular course, it makes more sense why those would be some of the examples that you use there. Okay, listen, I would absolutely love to keep going into the weeds with you on this one, but I think that a child is about to be dropped in the middle of the street if if I don't wrap this up. So if people want to see any of the work that you're doing these days, and obviously I guess all your books will be on Amazon and everywhere books are found. But what is the best place to go find what you're up to?
I have a website. It's antonionunez.com. And in antonionunez.com, I think that you can find also my social media handles. So you can find me at Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc., etc. So that is my go-to. Yeah, AntonioNunez.com.
Okay, I'll put that on the show notes. If anyone wants to see what Rocinante looks like, then they can go to Domestika and and buy your course, and there'll be plenty of the stuff we talked about today will be there, but Rocinante will be there, which is a very important part. All right, thanks again for your time, Antonio. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Francisco. Thank you for having me.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, and until next time.